Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are here with my former student, Song Kim, who is now the CEO of KovaDx, a biotech company. Song is a civil rights lawyer who used to work in politics in Korea and now works in the tech startup world. And we have so much to talk about today. So I want to thank you for coming to speak to my students and for making the extra time to speak to a broader audience through the podcast. I have so much to ask you. But before we start, just tell us about KovaDx and what it is that you do.
Absolutely. So we are using machine learning and optics to build a blood health monitoring tool for rare blood diseases, and we're starting with sickle cell disease.
I have a blood disease myself, thalassemia minor, so I feel like I could potentially use a blood monitoring tool in the
absolutely.
future.
And that is our goal, to make our tool accessible and available for folks like you, folks who don't have tools. So in the same way that, the way that we're kind of envisioning it is, in the same way that a glucose monitor completely transformed care for those with diabetes, is what we want to do for folks living with rare blood diseases.
That's so great. So now we need to talk about how this all happened, because when you took my class, Social Entrepreneurship Lab, it was 2020, right? It was like, you took half of it, then we went online for the pandemic, and then I never saw you in person
devastating.
Again. I think this is the first time I'm seeing you in person after that. No, that's not true. We went for a walk last summer, and I roped you into talking to my students. And so you, like, what I knew about you at the time was that you were a civil rights lawyer. You were doing a lot of work on creating awareness about supply chains, right? And workers' rights. And in my class, you worked on a mental health intervention. And then you graduated. And then before I knew it, you were working with this startup, like on a totally different topic. So tell us, maybe step back in terms of how you went from law to the School of Management, and then how you ended up now the CEO of the startup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love talking about it because I feel like I have such a twisty, windy path, but I don't think I'm the only one. And I feel like it's not talked about as much or, so I love sharing. So thank you so much for the question. So I started my career as a lawyer doing civil rights work in New York. I used to do forced labor litigation and doing immigrants' rights work, workers' rights work, doing forced labor kind of awareness raising, right, and building programs to increase access to legal representation for marginalized immigrant communities, like in the New York metro area, but also kind of throughout the country. So there are a few things that happened during my time as a lawyer that, I'll start off by saying, like, I actually, really loved the work that I got to do working with clients, doing impactful, like, litigation and policy work, and all of that was so meaningful to me. But there were a few moments that I started to have questions about this model of, using nonprofits to serve communities. So there's, this one case that I litigated. It was called David versus Signal International. I was on a team of 12 attorneys that was suing this big corporation in the Gulf Coast. They build ships and fix oil rigs and things like that. They were trafficking 500 Indian workers, right? And after 7 years or so of litigation, after like a 4.5-week trial, we won this big case on all fronts, right? And it was a historic case, it was precedent setting. It was this big win, right, for migrant labor and immigrants' rights and workers' rights. And it was like a kind of a source of celebration, right, because it was the first of its kind, right? It was such a big win that we actually drove this company that was doing horrible acts into bankruptcy, and they no longer existed. And so it was a big win, and it was a signal to the world, right, that you can't do this. Like, you can't, force people to work for you and then expect to go kind of unscathed. So while we were, celebrating, a month later, they just cropped up again with the exact same logo, a different name, but exact same logo, exact same, board, exact same executive team.
Oh my God.
And it was just like a slap in the face, right? Not just for us lawyers who were, just doing this as our job, but like for all of our clients who for years toiled, right, put their lives and their livelihoods and everything at risk for this case. And so it was at that moment that I think I felt like, the law is really, really powerful. And I went to law school because I thought it was such a powerful tool to bring back to my communities. But while the law is powerful, actually corporations, capitalism, right, the flow of money, like that's going to be where so much of the lasting change happens, unfortunately. And I felt like I didn't have enough of an understanding of that. So I had questions around that. And the second big thing that happened is the 2016 election. So even before the election, nonprofits doing direct services, like we were overwhelmed. But as soon as the election happened, I won't get into the details of it, but essentially our workload exploded. It was kind of no man's land for immigrants and migrants' rights at the time. And so, I spent all of the free time that I had, like I didn't have free time, but in all of my non-working hours, I was doing things like running legal clinics, right? I was, we were building coalitions to stop ICE from waiting at courthouses to courthouses like where immigrants were going for their family law cases. ICE agents would be waiting outside to detain people. Like highly awful, kind of illegal things were happening, and so we had all of this extra work, right, that we had to do because no one else was doing it, and I burned out. I saw my colleagues burning out, and I feel like it could have been prevented, right? Like we can't fault the election for that, right? Sure, the election is the catalyst for all of us burning out, but organizations and nonprofits, it felt to me like were for the most part not equipped to manage and care for their employees in a way to make the work sustainable. So from kind of an organizational management perspective, but also from a financial standpoint, right? Nonprofits are constantly asking, foundations for money, right? Or, they're getting government funding, and that's so dependent on who's in power, right? Or for foundations, you're asking money from basically wealthy people who have no real connection to the work that you're actually doing, and the money is usually tied to a program or a certain population or certain metrics, and it's foundations telling nonprofits how to do the work. And I also felt like that didn't sit right with me. There was tension there, and that didn't feel sustainable. So I had all of these.
There's also the flow of power from the same source as these problems many times.
Absolutely.
To pay for people to help work on them.
Absolutely. That conflict of interest, right? And I was like, there has to be a better way. I didn't mean to go to business school, right? Like business school wasn't the thing that I was like looking to do. But it just so happened, kind of divine intervention, I think, that I was talking to a friend, and she went to SOM, and she began talking about the program, and I was like, that actually sounds like exactly what I'm looking for. I never thought, an MBA would be the thing that answers my questions, but
most people don't know about the Yale School of Management, but it's not a business school. Like yes, it does give an MBA, but when it first started, it actually gave an MPPA, Masters in Public and Private, MPPM, Masters in Public and Private Management. So it was exactly for situations like this. Like, how do we manage government and nonprofit and private sector organizations?
Which is like so important, right? But I remember when I was working in my space, and I had a colleague who was going off to get her MBA. I'm going to be real, like we all judged her. We're like, why would... Like, what are you doing? You're going to the other side. But I get it, right? That's why I came to get my MBA. And while it was here, I really did take it as a sabbatical, right? I took it as a time to like cool down, right? Like just learn from as many sources as possible from, wonderful professors and classes like you and yours, but also like my classmates, right? Who come from such different worlds. Like, I lived in a bubble. I lived and worked in a bubble, and while social justice and being progressive is a big part of my identity, I didn't realize just how much of a bubble I lived in. And so I think some of the most meaningful kind of relationships that I built at SOM were people who came from completely different, backgrounds, like people who are more conservative leaning and who used to work in PE or, whatever have you, like a totally different world from me. And SOM, gave me the opportunity to like have a safe space, right, over drinks, at closing bell, right, where we could, banter, but really like get into the meat of some things that we disagreed about, but in a really safe space where we're not saying we don't care about each other, but we have different opinions, and to like really give each other the space to talk things out. I found that to be so, so valuable.
Yeah, it's not every day that a private equity person and a social justice person collide like that.
Yeah.
So then how did blood disease come into the picture?
Totally. So all of those questions that I had when I was working in nonprofits, I started to get, just an inkling, right, a sneaking suspicion that like entrepreneurship was actually the thing that kind of answered a lot of my questions. And so I took social entrepreneurship lab with you. I took a class with Kate Cooney. I forget what it was called at the time, ENV with Tristan Botello. And I was interested in it, but I never expected to be an entrepreneur because it's like not a thing that I had done before. And quite frankly, when I, thought about recruiting for jobs after SOM, I was applying for and interviewing for executive roles at nonprofits to bring the learnings that I've had about organizational management
back
into
to your world.
Exactly. But a big life-changing, world-changing, topsy-turvying event happened the year that I was graduating in 2020. When I was away at spring break and getting ready to start recruiting and beginning the process, the world shut down because of COVID. And all the interviews that I was going to, they gave me some iteration of we're interviewing you now, but we actually don't know if we'll have the funding to pay for your role in 6 months. This very low salary that we posted on the website, actually we can only give you half of that or a third of that. And after a few, kind of iterations of that, I thought to myself, maybe this isn't the time to just focus on recruiting. That's like a thing that we're supposed to be doing, but this isn't the time for that. And so I gave myself permission to just not do the things that was expected of me and really just dig in and work on some passion projects. So I started a podcast with a classmate from SOM. I started, working on a children's book with my sister and doing some curriculum work. And just kind of really leaning into the things that I wouldn't have had the space to do otherwise. During that time, my co-founder, Tim, he reached out to me on LinkedIn and he said, Song, I heard about you through the Yale entrepreneurial circles.
So he was a student here as well?
He was a PhD student at computer science department at Yale. And I think he must have heard about me through something related to your class because I was in your class at the time. And he said, Song, I see that you don't have a healthcare background, but I believe we are values aligned. Would you be open to a conversation? And at that time, it was, he sent over his deck and it was about sickle cell. And I had, barely heard of sickle cell before. So it was this might be spam, actually. I don't know, but I'm open-minded. So I'm going to have a conversation. So I met with Tim and my other co-founder, Yao, over Zoom during COVID. And the more I chatted with them, the more I learned about sickle cell, the more I sort of became obsessed with the problem. And it felt like I couldn't imagine myself at that time doing anything else. So.
And now here you are.
And here I am.
You were telling me earlier that you wouldn't want to be doing anything else.
Yeah, I feel like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be in this, season of my life. And I don't think it would have happened had it not been for COVID. And so yeah, my life has taken a lot of twists and turns. And I feel like not all of it was necessarily by choice, but like just me responding to the things that are happening and just, taking things as a gift and, kind of trying to find the bright light, the silver lining and yeah, being open to adventure and risk. And yeah, now I can't imagine doing anything else.
And I think it's really interesting that when they reached out, these were two scientists looking for a management person who could help them with the business stuff, right? And they found you somehow. And they initially wanted you to be chief operating officer, right?
Right.
Because they had like come up with the idea and tried to build the science. So they had like CEO and CTO roles, right?
Yes.
And then eventually you ended up transitioning to be CEO, which I think makes a lot more sense in terms of like, you're the person that's helping execute on the ideas and on the science.
Right.
So tell us about how that transition, like how you managed that change in the team and the dynamics, and both internally and in outward facing conversations.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate you asking about it because, entrepreneurship, and especially as like a first-time founder, there are so many challenges, and people always say, right, like the people things are actually the most challenging, right? Like managing people and relationships is actually the most challenging. And I think, by now I can kind of proudly say I know what some of my strengths are, and like relationships and people things are, I think, one of my strengths. And I think that's, why I like being in a CEO role. And, I love building relationships with our partners and all of these things. But oh man, like change management within the organization, like all of the things that we like, have learned in class sort of kind of like, out the window. And I felt like, I had to sort of learn really quickly what it means to be in a leadership role, like what it means to manage change and manage relationships in times of in times of stress, right? In times of change, maybe that is imposed on us externally, not even necessarily internally. So, when I first joined the company, I came in as COO, and my co-founder Yao, who is a doctor from Ghana, who is now a PhD student in engineering, bioengineering, he was CEO. But there were, a few kind of issues with that. So Yao is a scientist by training, and he was a PhD student, so he didn't have time to devote full time to the company. And because he didn't have a business background, right, like building strategy, right, and building relationships, right, and managing all of that systematically was not necessarily the things that he was great at, because his strengths are in the science. Like you couldn't, like I wouldn't know what to do in a lab, right?
Yeah.
In the same way that he maybe didn't necessarily have the right skill sets for this role, and so we, not only internally but externally, whenever we were in front of investors or whenever we were in front of our partners, like, I would be the ones running the meetings, right? I would be the ones, that was their point of contact. And so there was always kind of a bit of an assumption that I was the CEO, even though I wasn't. And so
So you're already playing that role, that outward-facing role. The CEO is the outward-facing person, and COO is more inward-facing.
Right. And so that misalignment, I think, led to a lot of lost opportunities. And so we had to make the decision that, like, we have to reorient and reorganize in a way that makes sense, even if it's hard.
Yeah.
And so, we, kind of sat down and sort of discussed what each of us wanted, right, out of the company, why we were doing what we were doing like a values exercise, and really kind of trying to understand each other's motivation so that we could, negotiate and align ourselves in a way that was best for ourselves personally as well as for the company. So there were some really kind of tough conversations, especially, switching up roles was one thing, but and this is something that nobody really like tells you or teaches you.
There's no
handbook. Yeah. but something that we really struggled with was, around like equity distribution and redistribution, and what it means for our contributions and what it means for our incentives to be aligned. And, no one tells us how to navigate that. And so we had to have some really difficult and challenging internal conversations to make sure that our company was set up in a way where all incentives were aligned, and that external stakeholders, whether they be our investors or our clinical partners, could trust that we would do what we say we're going to do.
Yeah, and I think, my mentees ask me about equity a lot. Like, what should I do if I want to recruit a co-founder or a coder or something? And like, what's the formula? And I've asked around a lot. Like, there is no answer. You just have to have a conversation about like, who's providing value and how, both in the past and in the present and in the future, and what it means to other stakeholders. And it's just, there's no right way to do it.
Yeah, and that's what I've been learning on the job.
So what are some ways that you've had to change in order to step into this role? Because it sounds like you never saw yourself as the CEO of a startup. I'm saying this on purpose because probably most people listening or watching, maybe some do, maybe some don't see themselves as a potential CEO, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't do it.
Right.
And you were trained in a different skill set previously.
Absolutely.
I mean, now you have the management skill set also, but you worked in a different culture, right? Like you were working in politics and law in Korea as well. We were chatting earlier, like we both come from cultures where women really are trained and normalized to speak more deferentially and perhaps have a softer tone. And maybe those aren't the things people expect or respond to from a CEO. What are some of the ways that you've had to recondition yourself? Or are there any ways that you feel you've been evolving through this role?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think
maybe now you're in the middle of it and it's too early to say.
Yeah, I feel like even now, even early on, I feel like it's been such a time of personal growth for me in a lot of ways. So, to this point about being a woman and being a woman of color, right, being an Asian American woman, like even when I was a lawyer and even when I was like, litigating cases, my opposing counsel tended to be like older white men. And so the dynamics that played out there were also interesting. And I have had to like learn to become more aggressive and like assert myself. Not that's like, those are the markings of a CEO, but that is like against my nature and something that I've had to learn to do in that kind of setting. So like, as women, I feel like we've had to condition ourselves throughout our lives, right, to navigate a space that has been told that doesn't belong to us. And so, I feel like I've kind of headed and dealt with those conditions as a lawyer a little bit differently in that I had to essentially respond with aggression, had to respond with, exactly, and be like ultra prepared, and like better prepared and just like better at everything than the others because of because when they come in, they expect me to be just meek and mild and right and not say the right things or whatever have you. In the CEO role, I feel like the thing that I've had to learn is, and I've had feedback from this kind of even early on, is that that when I come and in a room with my team or even with others, I slip into this role. I used to have the tendency of like slipping into this role of being like almost like a facilitator or like a consensus builder, rather than just making the call and making the decision and like saying, this is the decision, like follow it. And I'm still working on it, right? And I feel like when I first heard that feedback, I was like, well, at the time, I guess I actually wasn't CEO the first time that I heard that feedback. And I said, oh, well, actually, I was a CEO and I'm just, and they were taken aback and they were like, oh, we thought you were the CEO. Sorry about that. But yeah, so that's something that I've been thinking about is okay, how do I not be that person who's just trying to build consensus and make sure that everyone's happy and be people pleasing and really own the decisions that I know are right. And even if they're not right, that's okay, because I will own my mistakes and, and figure out a way to fix it. So that's absolutely something that I'm working on now. I think, when I walk into kind of like investor pitches and things like that, and I am, an Asian American woman, it's sometimes very clear, and especially when I'm talking about something like sickle cell, it becomes very clear very quickly, like, this person basically wants to do like a charity, like wants to do good in the world, and that's clear, but like maybe doesn't have, the skill sets. And so then I've had to learn how to navigate that and say up front, like, oh, actually, here is my, basically my resume. Like I am,
before people make assumptions.
Before people make assumptions. And, I can literally see people's like, their the way that they look at me kind of changes, and they're like, oh, okay, now you have credibility, right?
Now I'll engage with you.
Now, and not to say that that's everybody, right? Not to say that that's everybody, but that is something that I have noticed and I've had to learn to sort of navigate.
Yeah, I guess sometimes you're defending and pitching your startup and your idea and the importance, but also in some situations you have to defend and pitch yourself too.
Yeah,
as like,
absolutely.
Here's why this needs to be done, but also here's why we should be the people doing it, and here's why you should be paying us.
Yeah.
And even internally in your team, I think what I heard is that like there's always a balance. Like in some situations, it is about consensus building. In some situations, that is the process.
Right.
And if you're the CEO, there will always also be situations where you're the boss and you get to decide. And people, and then you execute, and your team helps you execute.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's helping people see you differently, but also seeing yourself differently.
I think that's such a big part of it. I couldn't agree more, and I so appreciate that, and I so appreciate you reflecting that back to me.
Yeah, and I also want our audience to know, like sometimes there can be a straightforward path to being a CEO. Not every path has to be so long and windy as yours.
Yeah.
So even if you don't look like the typical CEO,
right,
you might still have a straightforward path for yourself. Or you might have a long and windy path. Like we don't know how you'll get there, but that doesn't mean that you can't. And that doesn't mean that you can't also like adapt and adjust and just like step into opportunities and roles.
Absolutely.
I'm so grateful to you, Song, for taking the time to come share these learnings with us. And we're learning as we're discussing. We're so grateful for you.
I so appreciate you having this space and for welcoming me into it. It's been so wonderful to get to share my journey. I feel like there's not a lot of places to talk about like the true, right, like what it's really like being a startup founder, right, and like what it looks like for people who look like me, right, who have had my journey or who have my background or whatever have you. And so this has been so valuable to me as well. So I'm really grateful.
Thank you. Thanks for changing assumptions and for sharing with us.